Israel has invaded Lebanon. This, it claims, is a limited and targeted operation. But it also said that when it invaded Lebanon last time and pummeled huge swathes of the capital Beirut into the ground, killing hundreds of civilians and enacting the infamous military Dahiyya doctrine of civilian punishment, whose very guiding logic is disproportionality. Israel says it is principally fighting Hezbollah, a militant group that declined to disarm after the Lebanese civil war, with the Lebanese armed forces being confined to the sidelines. But huge numbers of the casualties so far have been civilians. Over 1 million people have been forced to flee. So who are Hezbollah? Listen to many Western sources and you will hear the same response. Hezbollah is a terrorist organisation. And that is, in the legal sense, true. Hezbollah is a prescribed organisation, which makes offering either material or moral support to the organisation a criminal offence under British law. Hezbollah is certainly no friend of the left. Indeed, it is increasingly a conservative and authoritarian group. But it is not inexplicable. It is not driven by madness or primal hatred. Even its adversaries admit that it has been for many years a canny political machine that has steadily grown into a serious adversary for Israel. That was, at least until a series of Israeli attacks on the organisation, including detonating bombs hidden in its communication equipment and killing its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, seemed to suddenly blunt its capabilities. To explain Hezbollah and the tangle of Lebanese politics from which it came, I spoke to Elia Ayoub, a UK-based Lebanese-Palestinian writer and researcher. In his excellently clarifying piece, Hezbollah, 10 Things You Need to Know, he pulls apart the many myths that have obscured our understanding of the group. You can read that on hauntologies.net. Elia is the founder of the Fire These Times podcast and the co-founder of From the Periphery Media Collective. Elia, welcome to Novara FM.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk about the history of Hezbollah, and I want to talk about the ways in which it's been formed as an organisation, not just in the context of Lebanon, but also in the sort of international context that is inescapable when we're thinking about how Lebanon works, how it's been formed as a state of its own right. But I want to begin by talking about what's happening right now. Mm-hmm. Israel has invaded the south of Lebanon. So far, we've seen a bombing pattern that is mostly focused on the south, parts of Beirut, and a place called the Bekaa Valley.
Yeah, the Bekaa Valley in the east of Lebanon, yeah.
Bekaa Valley, which is formed by these two mountain ranges, right? One of which forms the border with Syria, and one of which goes down the middle of Lebanon. But we've just seen in the last few hours that the Israelis have also started bombing in the north as well, in a place called Aito.
Aito, yeah.
And the population there is Maronite Christian. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could explain to us what you think is going on and where we are in this war.
Okay. I guess we can focus on the past month or so. Otherwise, there's probably too much to go through. Most people, I suppose, started focusing more on what's happening in Lebanon with the Pages attack, which happened, 3 weeks ago or so. Because of how shocking it was, and how, like, at the beginning especially, there were lots of questions of, like, how did they even pull it off? Some folks were thinking that, like, they actually hacked and how would that be possible because of the low tech of, all of that. It turned out to be actually more straightforward. The Hezbollah thought it was buying from a Hungarian front. It turned out to be the Israelis themselves, and so they were kind of booby traps from the beginning. That attack was followed the next day, almost 24 hours to the dot, by a walkie-talkie attack, which was smaller in many ways because fewer people had them, but still very bad. The first one, as I said, was pretty shocking. People just blew up in various places throughout the country. For the most part, quote-unquote operators of Hezbollah, although we can get into why that's a problematic framing. But that meant that, like, some guy in some grocery store, there was one doctor who was in an operation room, I believe, or something like that, with like a 1-month-old baby or 2-month-old baby or something like that. And there was no other adults in the room. So like the baby could have fallen off from the table or something like that. So many things could have happened, and so many things did happen. Quite a lot of people got killed. I actually do not have the latest numbers on me. It was definitely in the lower hundreds, I believe. And in terms of injured is many more. That was followed shortly after by the ongoing bombardments of Dahye. Dahye just means suburb in Arabic. It refers to the southern suburbs of Beirut. I say this because I've seen a bunch of English reportings calling it like the Dahye suburb, which just means suburb. And of course, South Lebanon and East Lebanon, the Ba'a, where historically are the quote-unquote Hezbollah strongholds, which again, in extremely problematic terms that we can get into. But that's how they're often referred. And not just. So what we've been seeing is the Israelis kind of pushing the line more and more in the past month or so. They bomb parts of Beirut that are not Dahye. They've parts of Batroun, which is a coastal city in the north, which is Maronite majority. Zrarta, which is the one you mentioned earlier, one of the villages there. And Eden as well. That's the one in Eden, actually, sorry. So quite a lot of different places. The fact that some places are Maronite majority doesn't necessarily mean much. Lebanese sectarianism functions in a way that might sound contradictory at first for, I guess, non-Lebanese. It's not as straightforward as like the Shias are over there or the Maronites are here and the Sunnis are over there or whatnot. Historically, there was a lot of mixing. Some mixing continued with the civil war. Some regions were more quote-unquote homogenized, which facilitated the rise of more sectarian parties than even before. So that's sort of what's happening now. As of time of recording, which is October 14th, the number of deaths in Lebanon are increasing. Just now, the attack you referred to, I think, killed 19 and counting. Yesterday, there was 20 odd something and counting. There are some parts, especially in the south, where entire families are killed at the same time. Everyone I know who is from the south or from Dahye, often if you're from Dahye, you're also from the south, like you have connections there, or of course in the Ba'a. Lebanon is very small. People need to know this. It's a very, very small country. Have been, my friends and like their families and whatnot have been displaced often more than one time. If they're in the south, there is, I think, a growing understanding that they may never go back. At the very least, not in the short-term future. We have this thing among, I think, many Lebanese of looking at the diasporas and folks who are thinking of leaving, and when do they start thinking of leaving, so that the folks who are still back home, when they start thinking of leaving, it's almost like something is telling them, if you want, that like this thing can last long, because this is not the first war, of course, that we've gone through, but this feels different for many reasons that maybe we can get into.
What feels different about it? And I was wondering also what feels different about it for you. You're not currently in Lebanon.
No.
But what is it like to watch from afar?
What's different is that it comes in the context of a 1-year and ongoing genocide in Gaza. And what's different is that it comes in the context of a Israeli government that's even more to the right than what is the norm in Israeli politics, which is pretty right-wing. The messianic far-right type of politics is sort of the norm right now in Israeli politics. And we've seen more and more either, I think his first name is Israel, actually, one of the ministers of Israel Katz, I believe, or something like that. For diaspora, I believe is his portfolio. They basically saying like Lebanon is not a real country, and describing all Shias as an enemy population. We've seen op-eds in various Western media outlets, including Newsweek. I saw it today, describing Lebanon as like, if it cannot be fixed, it must be broken up. Stuff like that. So pretty overtly colonial and imperialist terminologies that it's not that they did not exist before, they did, but it seems like they come now in a context where they have the momentum to create new facts on the ground as that's how they think of it. It's important to understand that Lebanon is where Israel developed its Dahye doctrine. And the Dahye doctrine is named after Dahye, obviously, because that's what they did in 2006. Effectively means targeting civilian infrastructure in order to make any kind of reconstruction as costly, as difficult, as impossible even as they can manage to accomplish. as a goal in and of itself. Like, it's not long-term goal necessarily, although it can come with some long-term goals, but that is a tactic in and of itself, because the idea is that you cannot, destroy Hezbollah by only going at their leaders or whatever. So you have to destroy everything around them, however they define this. And as we've been seeing now, they've basically been defining this as pretty much all of Lebanon.
Not that I take a great deal of comfort in international law, but it's very striking that the Dahiya Doctrine is expressly in contravention of international law. So international military law is defined on the principle of proportionality. You can respond, you can attack, but only if there are proportional measures. And the Dahiya Doctrine is explicitly disproportionate. It's explicitly over the top. It's explicitly extreme as a way of attacking civilian infrastructure.
Yeah, and they call it that. They call it disproportionate force. So like it's in their own definitions of it.
You mentioned earlier that there's also been this discussion from the Israeli government that Lebanon is not a real country. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if we could go back into the history and discuss how it was that Lebanon came to be a country in the first place. You also mentioned sectarianism in Lebanon, which is a very marked feature of the political system. It has what's called a confessionalist government, by which different positions in the government are allotted based on different religious identities. How do you see this formation and process? What is important for us to grasp about this process of the construction of Lebanon that would allow us to understand what's happening right now?
Yeah, there's a number of different ways we can approach this. Historically, you can go back to the Ottoman Empire times. There wasn't a thing called Lebanon. I mean, there were no nation states, obviously, during the Ottoman Empire. It was an empire. But you had different formations, either the Tanzimat or what came after it. The Beirut Tanzimat, for example, which would include parts of what is now modern Lebanon. You did have you had historical regions. Like you had Mount Lebanon, which was part of Syria at the time, Syria being a geographical region and also a legal category within the Ottoman times. And I'm not an Ottoman history expert necessarily, but that has shifted over the years, is my understanding. Some folks go back to the 1860s for the most part, is when you start seeing the formations of a modern Lebanon, even though there were no nation state yet. But as with so much of the world, this is when you start like having a nascent nationalism. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the region was divided by the victors of the First World War. Lebanon was basically handed over to the French alongside Syria, who further divided those two areas that historically the division between the two was not very rigid. This continued until the 40s. 43 technically is when Lebanon gains its independence, but this was still during the World War. And there was a Vichy government of France at the time, obviously, the Nazi collaborators. So effectively, Lebanon declared independence after the Second World War, so in 45. And since then, it's been a nation state like any definition of other nation states, part of the UN, one of the founding members, I believe, or at least of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and others. Sectarianism, in some sense, precedes the state, but was codified within the state. And this is, as I said, a combination of Ottoman legal stuff that I'm not an expert of, as well as the French Mandate. During the French Mandate, they prioritized certain elites over others. And this was especially the elites of Beirut, which were primarily Maronites and Sunnis. There was a sort of a informal understanding, like a gentleman's agreement, I believe even was the terms we used at the time. That wasn't actually written, but was kind of just understood at the time, that those two elites, among others, would be the ones sort of running the show. It doesn't mean that the other sects were not represented somehow, but clearly not in a proportional way or, what have you. Sectarianism changed a lot. Like on the surface level, it's kind of the simpler way of explaining it is that, the president has to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister has to be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of parliament has to be a Shia Muslim. And then all of the others kind of also high-ranking positions, like the governor of the Banque du Liban, the Lebanese bank, the chief of the army, what have you, have to also be allocated along sects. And then within the parliament, it's a different proportional in quotation system that allocates a very complicated way of allocating votes when people actually go to the polls and vote. You don't necessarily go to the polls and vote for this one person who then gets elected. There is a bit of a quota system, like that person has to also be, for example, let's say you're voting for an independent coalition that is against the sectarian system. They themselves have to put forward let's say in Beirut, like a Greek Orthodox and a Shia Muslim or what have you. In order to fight the system from within, you have to play within the system, because legally that's how you can vote. There are other complications, which makes it a very inefficient system that's extremely unpopular in Lebanon. And that's why, among other reasons, we've had a bunch of different protests, including in 2019, the most recent one and the biggest one at the time. The other thing is that sectarianism functions in a way that doesn't necessarily make sense logically, for lack of a better term, because again, it's not that, if the president has to be a Maronite Christian, that means that the only people he cares about are Maronite Christians. You have different coalitions that are formed. Historically, or 2005, post-2005, you had two big ones, which were March 8 and March 14, so named after the biggest protest that they had at the time. The long story short is that on February 14th, the Prime Minister Rafik al-Hariri was assassinated by the Syrian regime, and what followed is March 8, which was the one called by Hezbollah, and March 14, which was the one called by, at the time, a coalition of vaguely anti-Hezbollah and anti-Syrian regime forces that would then become their own coalition. But even since then, these have shifted. So one of the leaders of the March 14 coalition was Saad al-Hariri, who was the son of Rafik al-Hariri, the former prime minister, who was himself another billionaire, also prime minister, became an ally of Hezbollah later on, whereas in the beginning he was an enemy. And so you have a bunch of these shifting allegiances that are not new in Lebanon. And that's why for me, like, you have sectarianism as it's like the headlines, let's say, the surface level sectarianism. But in terms of how the political parties themselves operate, it's not quite simply like, the Shias on one side and the Sunnis on the other or whatnot. You have a lot of those cross alliances. In fact, the one I mentioned, March 8, is Hezbollah Amal historically. I mean, because it doesn't really exist anymore, but it's Hezbollah Amal and the Free Patriotic Movement, which is a Maronite party. So you have two Shia parties and one Maronite party. On March 14 side, historically, again, you had Sunnis, Maronites, Druze, some Shia parties that were anti-Hezbollah as well, and so on and so forth. Effectively, both coalitions had all of the sects for the most part. What shifted is the proportions between them. Like most of the Shias on the March 8 side, most of the Maronites on the March 14 side, and so on.
What are the dividing lines? If one coalition has all the sects involved and the other ones also have all the sects involved, what are the dividing lines between them? Initially
in 2005 was their positions vis-a-vis Syria. Vis-a-vis the Syrian regime specifically. As I said, March 14 was formed a month exactly after the February 14th assassination of Rafik al-Hariri. Hariri was a complicated, very corrupt billionaire figure, but in the 90s was very close to the Assad regime. In the early 2000s started becoming less and less so. And so the story goes, of course, is that they killed him off. And that created two roughly equal sides in terms of numbers, not quite, but there's no census in Lebanon, so it's kind of an educated guessing game.
And as far as I understand it, the reason why there isn't a census is because they don't want to have to readjust these proportions of people who appear in the parliament.
The last actual census was in the 30s before it was an actual state. And so there's no actual census because if they do so, as you said, like very likely Christians are fewer in numbers than they were in the 60s and 70s. Well, they are, we know that. And so they would have to rearrange if they are to be proportional, those parties. But interestingly, and again, this is one of the ways sectarianism functions in a way that may not seem logical at first. None of the other parties want that changed either. Historically, they've been kind of comfortable having one another as the enemy because it's kind of, I would argue, kind of the devil we know rather than having an independent party that can challenge you in a more fundamental way.
And since the formation of Israel, a major part of the demographic changes in Lebanon have been due to Palestinian refugees fleeing the formation of Israel, first in 48 and then in 67 as well, when Israel occupies the West Bank. That's something like 500,000 Palestinian refugees, according to UNRWA's estimates. That's 10% of the population of Lebanon, right? It's a huge population.
Yeah,
these people live in what are called refugee camps, but they're not tents like we might think of as sort of temporary refugee camps. They are very...
Yeah, they're not allowed to build certain things. They're not allowed to build permanent settlements, even though in some camps they de facto have, but legally they can. They cannot. They don't have access to most professions. There was a very brief moment when they changed that, but then the Maronite church actually opposed it, just to show that this sectarianism functions in certain different ways and might seem logical at first. And in terms of the numbers, again, a census is very complicated in Lebanon. Some numbers I've seen, yes, 500,000 is usually what is cited, but as far as I know, the only actual census done was like roughly a decade ago, slightly less so. And the numbers are slightly between 200 and 300,000. Regardless, it is a sizable percentage. And more importantly, like I am also Palestinian, but I grew up as a Lebanese citizen. And the reason for that is that in the 1950s, Palestinian Christians were given the nationality. So my grandfather was given the nationality, was naturalized. And there was some tits for tats, where again, it goes back to how sectarianism functions in Lebanon, was because some Christians were naturalized, you had some Palestinian Shias who were the ones in what's now northern Israel, who were also naturalized. And then that upsetted the Sunnis, so some Palestinian Sunnis were also naturalized, but not most of them. Today, the overwhelming majority of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon are Sunnis, partly due to this, well, most Palestinians are Sunnis historically regardless, but partly also due to this sectarianization of who gets naturalized and who does not. And this has benefited very specific parties historically, especially the right-wing Christian parties that have always used as sort of a Palestinian boogeyman in order to drive up their base.
I want to get to Hezbollah itself and how we should understand this organization.
Mm-hmm.
It's often referred to as an Iranian proxy. It's often referred to as particularly a Shia group. Or it's sometimes referred to as a sort of a Lebanese militant group that claims something about the defense of Lebanon against the Israelis. Mm-hmm. It's also sometimes claimed as part of a broad left-wing tradition. In things you've written, you've very explicitly pushed against that interpretation. Yeah. And I'm wondering, what is the correct frame here to think about Hezbollah in?
Yeah, okay. Historically, Hezbollah came out of the Israeli occupation. Like no Israeli occupation, if there were no Israeli occupation of Lebanon, there would be literally no need for a Hezbollah.
Which is between 1982 and 2000.
Yes. And there were like shorter occupations before that, but that's kind of the big one, yes. Of initially including the siege of Beirut, which included, of course, the Sabra and Shatila massacre not by Israel, as most people think, but by the Phalangists, overseen by Israel. So it was illegally their responsibility, but I want to emphasize this because I feel like the Phalangists get off from, like, don't get talked about as much. But anyway, so yeah, the 1982 to 2000 occupation of South Lebanon was basically the raison d'etre of Hezbollah, the reason why there was a reason for a party like them. Because otherwise, why would you have such a massively organized resistance movement against nothing? There had to be something, and that was the Israeli occupation. There are other things also that led to not necessarily the rise of Hezbollah, but there are two things that led to the rise of Hezbollah: the occupation of southern Lebanon, of course, and the Iranian theocratic revolution in 1979. Those two had to come together, and of course they were 3 years apart. Iran helped form Hezbollah in the early days, but Hezbollah grew in South Lebanon. Those are two things that happened at the same time. South Lebanon was very brutally occupied by the Israelis. Other things that also led to the rise of Hezbollah, so not the creation, but the rise of Hezbollah, is the Syrian intervention in 1976, which led to a de facto occupation of parts of Lebanon as well. At the time, Hafez al-Assad's main goal in 1976,
who is the prime minister, who's president of Syria?
President of Syria, father of the current president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, wanted to crush the Palestinian resistance in 1976. At the time, most of Lebanon was divided between two main coalitions that call themselves, a bit confusingly, the Lebanese Forces and the Lebanese National Movement. The Lebanese Forces are the ones that are better known as the Phalangists, but the Phalangists were a component of the Lebanese Forces, the biggest one. And the Lebanese National Movement, the LNM, was the one that was Palestine aligned, so Palestinian aligned. Another thing that's important to understand that partly explains the rise of Hezbollah, so not the creation of Hezbollah, but its rise into a hegemonic force in the 80s and especially in the 90s, is the influence of the Syrian regime. Syrian regime in Lebanon, when we say Syrian regime, Nizam, we are talking about the Assad dynasty, since 1970 especially, with Hafez al-Assad first, of course, and then Bashar when he took over in the year 2000. So that's 5 decades ongoing of that dictatorship. In Lebanon, their intervention in Lebanon in 1976 came with a de facto occupation that continued until 2005. So in many ways was longer than the Israeli occupation, but it was of a different nature. It wasn't only as brutal all the time, let's say, as a military occupation of South Lebanon. It was also integrated into the Lebanese system itself. And we can get into this because this is important in the 90s especially. Syria, or Hafez al-Assad, initially invaded Lebanon in 1976 with his army to crush the Palestinians. And this was very explicitly their purpose at the time. This what led to the Tel Zatar massacre in 1976 as well. And in 1977, the assassination by Kamal Jumblat, which was a very open thing. And Hafez al-Assad spoke to his son at the time, Walid Jumblat, and basically it was a very open exchange that, I killed your father, effectively. Kamal Jumblat being the leader of the Lebanese national movement. So the Lebanese national movement doesn't exist anymore, but it was a coalition, at times loosely organized, other times more kind of coherently organized, that had by 1976 and also 1977, but 76, let's stick to the first 2 years of the civil war, control over most of Lebanon. So by 1976, the LNM and their Palestinian allies had already kind of close to winning the civil war, and that's why you had a panic, effectively, by the right-wing Christian elites. The Lebanese forces, i.e. the Phalangists, which were the biggest component within the Lebanese forces. The names are confusing, I know. The stated purpose of the intervention was to, quote-unquote, save the Christians, which meant at the time the elites. The LNM included Christians. The LNM included Christians and Shias and Sunnis. It was a left-wing secular coalition. Some pan-Arabists, Nasrites, because Nasserism was big at the time, some seculars, nationalists of the left variety, of course the communists, the Druze dominated the Progressive Socialist Party, which is a bit of a misnomer today, but this is what it was historically, and other groups that were allied with the PLO and other smaller Palestinian groups. 76 is the beginning of the end of the LNM. The end of the LNM is basically 1982 with the Israeli invasion. The LNM didn't quite exist anymore at the time, but its offsprings, so to speak, offshoots, were still there. The communists were still there, the nationalists were still there, and of course the different Palestinian movements and guerrillas were still there. 1982, i.e. the Israeli invasion, forced the exile of the PLO from Beirut into Tunis.
This is the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Yes, led at the time, of course, by Yasser Arafat. So by 1980s, by the time the Israelis actually invaded, the LNM was already at its weakest point. Hezbollah started growing out of their main ally, the Amal movement, Amal meaning hope in Arabic. Initially, a sort of a interesting-ish movement that was working class oriented, left-wing in a religious way as well. It's a bit confusing, a bit complicated, but one of their founders was a bishop, for example, a Christian bishop, but then dominated by Shias. And especially because they were active in the south during the Israeli occupation of the south, most people in the south are of Shia origins. That's the dominant background of people in the south. So it became a dominant Shia movement. One of the reasons why Hezbollah grew out of Amal is that Amal was seen as too complacent towards the Israeli occupation. And in fact, Amal battled a bunch of different Palestinian forces as well. There was a rivalry between Hezbollah and Amal in the early days. By early days, I mean the late 80s now. And they even had a war called Harb al-Ikhwa, the War of the Brothers, that in which Iran was backing Hezbollah and Syria was backing Amal. Hezbollah won that battle, and the deal between the two, they kind of found a compromise, is that Amal would take over parts of the government and kind of be the Shia representation within Lebanese sectarian politics, and Hezbollah would focus on the south, on the Muqawamah, on the resistance.
And what year is this?
This was after 89, I believe, was the war.
At the end of the Lebanese Civil War. Yeah,
exactly. In 1990 is when you had the Ta'if Agreement, which is the agreement that ended officially, in any case, the Lebanese Civil War. But it happened in a context where the Syrian domination of Hafez al-Assad especially was at its highest. And so they also imposed a sort of a different sectarian system than existed before the 70s, in which there was a somewhat reduction of Christian power. And that's part of the resentment that continues to feed part of the right-wing Christian politics today in Lebanon. And that's why there is a very strong anti-Syria politics among that community that doesn't have much to do with Syrians in Syria and the revolution there and human rights or whatever. It's about the role of the Syrian army in Lebanon itself. By the 90s, the occupation of South Lebanon was ongoing until the year 2000. Hezbollah became by then the dominant party, the dominant movement within the Muqawamah, which was not just Hezbollah, but they were by far the most powerful and organized force. Part of why they were disorganized is those that I mentioned, in addition to their own role in weakening and even killing some of the leaders of the communists at the time, like Mehdi Amel and Hassan Nasrallah. That was in 1987. So it's a bit of the Iranian playbook in the sense that people who know in 1979 communists were part of the Iranian revolution against the Shah, and then they became a bit of a threat, obviously, to the rising Ayatollah. And a bit of that, it's a bit more messy, but a bit of that was replicated in Lebanon itself. And this was 87. So by the 90s, there was kind of no one else, and they were the dominant group. This doesn't mean that they did not also ally themselves with movements that they were formerly enemies of. I mentioned Amal, the communists are another ones. The SSNP, which is a very confusing movement, technically far right, historically presented itself as on the left as well, also part of that coalition. And they were the ones who were resisting Israel. And that's why by the time 2000 happened and the liberation of South Lebanon, the al-Muqawamah, the resistance, became associated with Hezbollah.
Part of my sort of worry here is that the way people approach the occupation of Palestine is as something that is extraordinarily, endlessly complicated, and that they couldn't possibly get a handle on. They say, oh, it's just too messy, everything is greyish, everything is too nuanced, and so on, which undercuts the basic fact, right, which is that the IDF is an occupying force in the West Bank, certainly. Obviously, it's committing a genocide in Gaza. These are simple, very straightforward facts. Maybe I'm being too hasty, but what I feel like I'm getting from this extremely detailed and extremely well-informed story that you're giving me is a sort of that the situation in Lebanon, the situation of what Hezbollah is, does not allow us to have this simple kind of grounding fact to which everything else has to return. Is that a fair assessment of the complexity of it?
Yes. It's important to just remember that Lebanon is not Palestine. Two different contexts, of course, historically linked, but there's no sectarianism in Palestine in the same way. It's not part of that history. And the influence of Iran and Syria and Saudi Arabia and the West and whatnot is not integrated in Palestinian politics in the same way. And more importantly, Palestinians have been dealing with the reality of Israel since 1948. The Lebanese is different. It's a sovereign nation that dealt with Israel as an enemy occupier. But then when the occupation ends in South Lebanon, then that's the enemy that's to the south of our borders. You see what I mean? Yeah. It's more of a hostile nation, a hostile state, rather than like a permanent occupier. Even though in the common parlance, it's not uncommon to call them the occupation, because it's common to refer to them how Palestinians refer to them, like historically. And so Hezbollah is a very complicated, messy, at times contradictory movement, party as in political party that's integrated in Lebanese politics, as well as an armed group. So movement is the historical stuff, is where did it come out of? It's a bit of the self-mythologizing of Hezbollah as the party of the oppressed. Nasrallah himself, being the second leader of the Musawi, was killed by Israel in the early 90s. I wrote a piece for 972 recently about the way the Israelis celebrated the death of the assassination of Musawi in the early 90s and how it resembles a lot how they've been talking about the assassination of Nasrallah, and how all of their predictions of what Musawi's assassination would lead to turned out to be wrong. But we can get into that.
Because they thought that it would lead to the downfall of Hezbollah, but in fact, Nasrallah was a much more effective leader than they were expecting, and that led to the increase in Hezbollah's power. Yeah,
and I'm happy to get into that specifically, why I think that killing Nasrallah was a pretty good thing for Hezbollah in terms of PR win.
Let's talk about Nasrallah. I think he is the figure everyone associates with Hezbollah, probably the only in the West figure that people will know. Talk to us about not how he came to power, because that's obvious. It's because the Israelis killed his predecessor.
Yeah.
But then what made him an effective leader? Why did Hezbollah not fall apart in those days when he became the leader? And then why has he become such a charismatic figure?
Nasrallah took over from Musawi in the early 90s. He was always a pretty conservative figure and ultra-religious figure. But he started off more extreme than he ended up being. And by extreme, I mean specifically ideologically. As a politician, there were certain things about him that were extreme, but not necessarily too different from other Lebanese politicians. He was a very effective orator. He was himself a scholar of course, of the Quran. He was a Sayyid, which means that he claims descendants from the Prophet Muhammad himself. and he was very eloquently spoken. He spoke very comfortably in Quranic Arabic as he would in Lebanese Arabic, and he would mix the two. And it's a very like despite all of my issues I have towards him, it was something that was even pleasant to listen to, in terms of like, it was coherent, it was eloquent, it's almost poetic at times, because again, he would know how to cite the Quran. But also crucially, I'm saying this because I saw a bunch of folks in the West, especially, or at least in English media, mention this like it was a shocking revelation. But he was very comfortable citing the Bible. He was comfortable citing Nelson Mandela because, again, a Shia cleric means that he is a scholar of the Abrahamic faiths. And he was also which include Christianity and Judaism, obviously. And he was also secularism is a complicated term in the context of Lebanon, but he had elements of his politics that were secular, in the sense that he was comfortable having non-Shia allies, including, as I mentioned, the Christians, since the Moam Khail agreement about 20 or so years ago, in 2006, actually. Which is when he allied with the Free Patriotic Movement, which is an alliance that technically continues to this day, which is a Maronite majority movement. In terms of his role within Lebanon, before 2006, primarily as the leader of the Muqawamah, he was seen as that figure. He wasn't even that integrated into the day-to-day politics of Lebanon. Certainly not in the 90s. And that afforded Hezbollah a sort of a distance, especially among their supporters, as like, we're not like the others. We're not like the other parties. We're not like Amal, which is the closest thing to us in terms of demographics. But Amal is, they have the Speaker of Parliament, they have their ministers, and at the time, they didn't have that. They progressively integrated the Lebanese political system, especially after 2005. And that's where this kind of the second phase, if you want, or third phase even, of Hezbollah. And this is where I think a lot of people stopped kind of paying attention, especially in the West and on the left, to what Hezbollah became in terms of its integration within the Lebanese political system, how it became more and more conservative, and other stuff that we can get into.
So what are those three phases again? Sorry. So the first phase is directly opposing the occupation of southern Lebanon.
Yeah.
The second phase is the beginning of the integration into the Lebanese political system. And the third phase is this increasing, growing conservatism within the movement.
Yeah, and then becoming effectively the dominant party within Lebanese politics.
Right.
And especially in the past, well, it's been growing since 2005, but past decade or so, I would argue. I don't know how exactly one would start calculating that, but they became the de facto kingmakers of Lebanese politics. But even saying that, I have to add some caveat, like being de facto kingmakers doesn't mean that they are just the ones doing that kind of decision. They also had to navigate a complicated sectarian arena. One of the reasons why, for example, in 2019, they wanted to maintain a close relationship with very corrupt figures like the Prime Minister, Saad al-Hariri, and the governor of the Bank of Lebanon, Riyad Salameh, is that they wanted a buffer between their own politics and the West, for example. They did not want the Lebanese state to be associated as just Hezbollah. So it was good for them to have people and politicians that historically were more aligned with the Saudis. And so this says that like they were able and always have been willing to navigate Lebanese politics. But crucially, unlike all of the others, Hezbollah has the added weight, political weight, that its arms allow it to. And in 2008, there was a very short civil war, effectively, that lasted 5-6 days, in which Hezbollah effectively militarily took over parts of Beirut and Mount Lebanon. And that since then, it's been kind of a frozen situation. They didn't declare victory in the sense that like their enemies were defeated. The enemies continued to be part of Lebanon, of the Lebanese state and of the part of the government and whatnot. And one of the main ones, the Hariri's future movement, ended up becoming an ally of Hezbollah later on. So this is just to say that like they have been willing to use force and brutality when they needed. And they otherwise, I don't think if they are not willing to also use diplomacy and politics and whatnot, they would not have survived for this long.
The other major piece of context here in this period for Lebanon is that it enters a very, very, very intense economic crisis.
Yes.
Lots of people leave the country. The currency is devalued. I think it's either 96 or 98% over the course of a few years. And then there are a series of major shocks that happen. There is, of course, the COVID pandemic, which hits Lebanon very hard. There is the explosion people have seen in the Beirut harbor. There are a series of other crises and disasters. How does Hezbollah fit into these? So the one way I've seen it maintaining its popularity is that it functions as a sort of social welfare organization. Is that how it's been able to survive in this extremely difficult situation for the Lebanese economy? And how would you say that it functions both as instigator of that crisis and benefactor?
Right. I mean, this is where they become very similar to the other Lebanese parties. Social welfare is how sectarianism replicates itself. In the absence of a nationwide welfare system, it's the various sectarian political parties that offer those social welfares. One example I often give is that in the early days of the pandemic in 2020, Saad al-Hariri, the prime minister I mentioned, was offering vaccines, the COVID vaccine, to folks who were in the north of, like in Tripoli, a Sunni majority city that historically he was, trying to get some votes. And so that became the Hariri vaccine to people who got it in Tripoli. So in that example, in terms of a social welfare movement, Hezbollah is very much like the others. It's just that historically, I would argue it's been more effective than the others at separating politics from the social welfare stuff. And in fact, one of the moments in which you saw a bit of a crisis within this confidence that they were projecting, like, we will always care for you, whatnot, is that in the early days in October 2019, when we had a big uprising against the government that was at the time already dominated by Hezbollah, Nasrallah went on TV and basically said to his supporters that even if the Lebanese economy collapses, your salaries will be secured. We will care for you, we will take care of you, don't worry. Now, how much did they follow through with that promise is debatable, and there has been a lot of internal tensions and resentment in between October and December, which is basically when we had our protest movements. You had a lot of people who were nominally supporters of the party join us on the streets. I was there. And saying things like, maybe they don't oppose Nasrallah himself as a person and as a religious speaker and as a religious person, because he's also he was a cleric, but that they want a separation between the Muqawamah, so again, the movement, the resistance as a movement which has its roots in the south. They wanted a separation between that and what the party became as it integrated more and more the Lebanese system, if you see what I mean. In terms of social services that Hezbollah provides, they historically have done it more effectively than others, but they are not unique in and of itself, and that's why other sectarian parties also have a hold, at least a hegemonic hold, or the majority is very hard to assess, but a hegemonic one over quote unquote their areas or their neighborhoods or their communities. All of these is in quotations, and Hezbollah is just another party that does that. They just do it better, more efficiently, historically anyway, and with more stable funds, because the Iranians were always more willing to give them money compared to the others that had to kind of negotiate money. Like the Lebanese forces getting money from the Saudis was not always a steady stream of money. So among other reasons.
Does that role as a sort of social services operator, does that mean that people get included in it as quote unquote operators?
Yes.
That otherwise wouldn't be. So, for example, I think you mentioned at one point in your article on this, people should go and read, it'll be linked in the description, was something about this kind of hypothetical scenario in which, your cousin gets you a job as a security guard and now you are a Hezbollah operative,
yes.
Right? And so the way in which it operates is not as lots and lots of armed, trained soldiers, right? But as a mass sort of organization that contains a huge number of different roles, which really not exactly blur the lines of this kind of military targetability, but just make it sort of impossible to really understand like that.
It's that. It's really that. It's the fact that Hezbollah has scouts. The Mahdi scouts, they're just scouts like the Christians would have their own scouts. So there's like Hezbollah aligned scouts, but they're still scouts. They're still like kids who are doing scout stuff. And anecdotally, like my first ever job was at this blood donation NGO, and one of the first groups that came to donate was a Hezbollah aligned NGO in quotation. I don't know how you want to call it, charity. Call them a charity, a religious charity, that just came and donated blood and left, and that's it. And we're not like a Hezbollah NGO. We're not even Shia majority or whatnot. We're just a group in NGO that was collecting blood in Beirut. They heard of us, they contacted us, they asked, can we donate blood? We said yes, and that was the end of it. Some of those people would be called Hezbollah operatives. Because by definition, if you are part of a wider movement, you're communicating with your higher ups. And that means that at some point, if you get to a certain level in that hierarchy, you will have greater access to certain communication tools, as the pages would be the example here, and so on and so forth. So most of Hezbollah's communication is wired. So the pages attack that was reported in very messed up way, in my opinion, especially in the West, for the most part, those were very low-ranking individuals, a lot of them very young, that just found themselves in a situation, and that's it. The economic crisis in Lebanon, especially since 2019, means that jobs are scarce. And so you have lots of people who were just in a situation where I mentioned this like anecdotally, but it's not far off from like actual scenarios of like, sorry, not anecdotally, like as an example, a bit of an imagined one, but it's not that far off from what happens. And I do know stories like that. Of like, yeah, you know someone in your neighborhood that's connected to the Al-Hizb, the party, and you need a job, and that person has a job for you. And that job doesn't have to be Hezbollah related. It's not necessarily that like you joined the party. It's more that your connections to the party is what allows you to get that job. And that's not specific to Hezbollah, as I mentioned. The Hariri vaccine is another example I mentioned initially, but like Hezbollah can cancel, if you're part of that community, student debt maybe, can help out with rent. If you're the family of a martyr, you might get like a monthly allowance, stuff like that. And that makes it a social movement in addition to the politics of it all.
The other major player, of course, we've touched on a few times, but not gone into depth here, is Iran. Mm-hmm. Hezbollah is often claimed to be an Iran-backed militia. Perhaps I don't know to what extent this is true. It seems striking me as it's so widely reported, it's so widely sort of accepted. Certainly Nasrallah at some point says that, everything we have is because we are backed by Iran. How do you see their role not only now, but if we're in an escalatory pattern where this war gets worse and worse and worse, how do you see Iran's role there?
So the relation between Hezbollah and Iran is definitely the more controversial one. I'm talking within Lebanon itself. I'm kind of forgetting a bit of how it's talked about in the West, but we can get into that. In terms of it being Iran-backed, yes, that's accurate in a very literal way, in the sense that they are backed by Iran, as in Iran supports them. So in that sense, they're Iran-backed. But the way it's often used is as a synonym for proxy, and that they don't do anything on their own, that they don't have a kind of a local and even internationalist politics or international-oriented politics that is independent from Iran. They are aligned with Iran and very close to Iran. And as I mentioned in the early days of Hezbollah's formation, they were partly formed by Iran, but the more integrated into the Lebanese state and the Lebanese system, especially in the past 2+ decades now, or 2 decades or so, the more the relationship with Iran kind of started splitting between we do our things domestically, which is very Lebanese, and there's a more of a international dimension, which might be more Iran aligned. And that gets very complicated and messy, and it changes from time to time. There was even a period in 2011, as the Syrian revolution became more bigger and bigger within Syria, that it wasn't even entirely certain where Hezbollah would stand vis-a-vis the Assad regime. There's a very short period of time, in roughly 2011. As we know, later they ended up backing the Assad regime, which was one of the other controversial decisions they've made because for the first time they had to justify their weapons in a way they didn't have to do so against Israel. Israel was a foreign occupier in South Lebanon, very straightforward enemy in that sense, as far as most Lebanese are concerned. And obviously, the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel showed that Hezbollah was able to hold its own, at least against the Israelis, and that made at one point Nasrallah was the most popular Arab politician, which is saying a lot because he's Shia and most Arabs are Sunnis. And so that shifted after 2011. There was a widespread wave, of course, the Arab Spring, that came with Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen in different ways. Iraq had it late in 2019 when Lebanon had it in also different ways, and Syria. And Hezbollah was arguably fairly popular among Syrians before 2011. There was they are the Muqawam, again, the same story. Like, they are the ones who resisted Israel. And because they're kind of the only ones who do so, for even anti-Assad Syrians, it was very difficult for them not to acknowledge that. Because if they compare it to what has Hafiz al-Assad and then Bashar al-Assad's done with the Golan Heights, which have, of course, since been annexed by Israel, Hezbollah was the only example of someone doing something about the occupation. Whereas the perception of the Assad regime at the time, which was even heard on the streets of Syria, like it was part of the chanting, is like, why are you sending the tanks to us? Why aren't you sending the tanks to the Golan Heights to liberate them? That sort of thing. And Hezbollah because it had that reputation as being the only one which resisted Israel, and successfully so to various degrees, of course. Israel is still a superior military power in that sense. But to a lot of Syrians, they didn't quite expect that Hezbollah would then turn their guns against them. But that's what they did. And they did more. They got more and more integrated within what ended up becoming known, of course, as the Syrian Civil War, as the ones that were on the side of Bashar al-Assad. Now, there are parts of that conflict, to be very vague about it, it's not necessarily our focus here, but it's important for the story, that were very straightforward black and white. Like, Hezbollah was opposing a very extreme Sunni jihadi party. And so very few people were...
The al-Nusra Front? Or...
Yeah, the Nusra Front at the time, yeah. And so that was also good PR-wise for Hezbollah, because they were able to protect Christians, for example, in Syria. And that was very good image building in that sense. But the more controversial and even, in my opinion, of course, downright reactionary element of it is that they sacrificed a lot of men to support Bashar al-Assad, the same men that could have been in the south for a future resistance against Israel. And this is part of the criticism today. A lot of Syrians, those in Idlib and those who are forcibly exiled, and those in Sweda, which is nominally under control of the Assad regime but has an autonomous status, are very anti-Hezbollah and celebrated the death of Hassan Nasrallah. These are things that many people, I think, from the outside might view a bit confusingly, not know why it's happening and whatnot, but that's because it's much messier than just the party that resisted Israel and everyone else, because that same party had a different politics in Syria. And for Syrians that experience that party as from the perspective of like they are literally invading us, or they are besieging us as they did in Madaya, or as they contributed to the fall of Homs and the fall of Aleppo, this is a party that is the enemy. And more importantly, a party of non-Syrians. So they're part of this internationalization of the Syrian civil war. That obviously you had the global Sunni jihadism, but you had equivalent is difficult, but you had a parallel to that among Shias that were sent by Iran. And in Syria, the status of Hezbollah as a proxy gets messier. I always focus the distinction between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hezbollah in Syria. But yeah, the controversy there is that they were supposed to, as the story goes, in the early 90s, after the Taif agreement, they won't let go of their weapons because they had to resist Israel. But then once the occupation ended, they're supposed to give back the weapons, or at least be integrated into the Lebanese state as the other militias did. It doesn't mean the other militias don't still have weapons, but they're not at the same scale anymore. And the fact that they then used those weapons first against other Lebanese in 2008, and then of course against Syrians after 2011, especially after 2012, is part of the second shift, if you want, of what Hezbollah became, and especially how it came to be perceived
as a more conservative force.
Yes, I would argue it's always been conservative, but it's more conservative, and it became more and more conservative. On social issues, Hezbollah has maybe the worst track record, if not at the very least among the worst track records when it comes to women's rights. As recently as last year, Nasrallah said like gay people should be killed. It's one of those things that they are of course opposed to any kind of. There's no civil marriage in Lebanon. They are among the parties that oppose it, and they have threatened and even killed a number of their opponents. That's something that the others haven't done since 2005, 2006. So in Lebanon in 2005, after the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri, the first two people who were assassinated were Samir Asir and George Howie. Samir Asir was a journalist of Lebanese, Syrian and Palestinian, actually Christian origins. And George Howie was one of the former heads of the Lebanese Communist Party, and also a Christian of origins. And in both cases, they were assassinated by Hezbollah. And this wasn't one of those like conspiracies, it was pretty straightforward. It was known even at the time by themselves. So George Howie was killed 3 weeks after Samir Asir. He was fleeing Hezbollah and he was talking about it in those terms. And when then they came for Lokman Slim just 2 years or 3 years ago, early 2021, Lokman Slim, another Shia actually of origins, a memory worker who was based from Dahiya, an ancestral connection to Dahiya, and based there and lived there, and he was gunned down in South Lebanon. He was speaking before his death, in the weeks that led up to his death. He was saying, I'm getting death threats by Hezbollah. And Hezbollah supporters were putting flyers outside of his house, basically threatening him to death. So there was very, very little debate at the time. Even Nasrallah's son himself posted on Twitter and then deleted it, basically celebrating Lokman Slim's death. And that parallel universe, if you want, of what they also do, in addition to everything I've talked about, trying to be more nuanced about them and whatnot, is why I think other folks in the Lebanese context, have more difficulties being this nuanced towards Hezbollah. Because when it comes to it, they are the only party that has not just threatened people with death, but carried that out. Threatened, that's not true. Many parties have threatened other folks with death, but in terms of the capacity that Hezbollah does and how often they do it, they do stand out.
We've heard an enormous amount about Hezbollah's capacity over the last sort of year, particularly in relation to, in comparison to Hamas, which is a much less powerful military force. Particularly, we've been told a lot about Hezbollah's missile capacity. They're hundreds of thousands of missiles, which are from, I presume, mostly from Iran.
Yeah, from Iran. They are.
Yeah. However, that's perhaps not the main way in which they might bog Israel down in an occupation in southern Lebanon. The thing about asymmetrical warfare in particular is that you don't have to win.
Yes, exactly.
You just have to outlast the opponent. What is there to say right now about Hezbollah's military capacity? And has it been affected by this pager attack and then by the subsequent bombings of the different commanders and units and so on?
Well, certainly that has weakened them. There's no doubt about it. Like, this was not a good thing for them. But one thing that's often missed, and I wrote in that article, the third one was like the best thing that, it was a bit of a listicle format. The third thing on that list is that the best thing that Israel can do for Hezbollah is a ground invasion. And this was, I think I published it like 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. In that 972 mag, I repeated the same thing. And I'm not saying this just like to boast myself. It's not a difficult thing to understand when you know where Hezbollah came from and what their background is. Their raison d'etre, as I said, was Israel, the Israeli occupation. And as I mentioned, they have been at their weakest when they turned their guns against Lebanese and Syrians. And when they have been part of the corrupt status quo in Lebanon and, from the perspective of Syrians who oppose the Assad regime as the foreign occupiers in Lebanon. That's when they've been at their weakest because they've had to kind of deploy more resources, not just in terms of men on the ground, but in terms of just justifying what they're doing in a way that they don't need to with Israel. Now they're back at that. Now the Israelis gave them the original raison d'etre, gave them the original purpose of where they come from, to the point that now also close friends and acquaintances and associates and whatnot and comrades from Syria who were victimized by Hezbollah they make that distinction. Like in Syria, we want them gone. But as far as Hezbollah's role is against Israel, there's just a recognition that there's no one else that can do anything about it. And so that's what I mean when I say, like, I argued this a few years ago as well, like there is a bit of a symbiosis between the Israelis and Hezbollah when it comes to how they perceive one another. And just in the simple sense that they are each other's best boogeyman or best other. They're the most effective. It's so effective for the Israelis to say that they have Hezbollah to their north, even more so than Hamas. And part of the justification, the reasoning that Netanyahu himself has been putting forward is that he claimed that, Hezbollah was planning also an October 7th style attack. And that freaked a lot of people out because they know that Hezbollah is stronger than Hamas. And within Lebanon itself, Hezbollah has always had some capacity at lasting long term. And that's why, like, the fact that the Israelis are actually entering and staying in parts of Lebanese territory. And I should note that they haven't done it in the same kind of grandiose manner they did in 1982, where they quite literally just took the tanks and drove to Beirut. They can't do that now. It's impossible for them to do that now because tanks are very easy targets, especially at night. in a very complicated hilly terrain like South Lebanon especially. Not to mention if they even try to go to the east, which I don't think they will, because that's even more complicated there, especially being so close to Syria. So right now we're almost, it's not quite back to the 1980s, obviously. It's not the same context, not the same Hezbollah even. Nasrallah was in his 20s and he wasn't part of any kind of leadership role or whatnot. Not to mention that now we don't even have a leader of Hezbollah yet. And Hezbollah has very smartly, I think, decided not to have a leader yet. They don't want to have any kind of outstanding targets. And they're organizing pretty effectively, as far as I can tell, against the Israelis. And since Nasrallah was assassinated, more rockets have been sent towards Israel than any time beforehand. More effectively, even more damage. Just today, I think 4 IDF soldiers were confirmed killed yesterday. That didn't happen when Nasrallah was in power because there was an understanding, even within Hezbollah, that their role is to effectively drain out the Israelis from overtaking Hamas entirely in Gaza by having a northern front. Controversially in Lebanon, to be fair about, I'm not saying good or bad, but it is a controversial thing within Lebanese politics itself. And now they don't have to do it in the same way because now they can even dissociate themselves from Hamas and not talk about Gaza and whatnot and just focus on the invaders at home. And that's better for them politically because roughly up until the year 2023, like up until last year, before I think it was May or something, the relationship between Hamas and Hezbollah was not particularly good. There was a rapprochement between the Iranians and Hamas and also via the Iranians with Hezbollah. Partly due to Syria, because Hamas actually backed the uprising against Bashar al-Assad, whereas Hezbollah intervened in Syria to protect it. And there was even a moment, I think it was in Qusayr, which was in the border between Syria and Lebanon, on the Syrian side, where Hamas and Hezbollah quite literally battled one another. And so it's not as simple as to go back to the whole Iran-backed and Iran proxy. It's not as simple as all of those people just agree and all like one another and whatnot, because at one point they weren't even allies. So this is what I mean when I'm saying that the picture gets more complicated when you just think of them as political parties, as they have their own interests, they shift with time, they may have an ideology, but it doesn't mean that they just follow it as if it's some commandment or whatever. Hamas, we know, has been more pragmatic often before October 7th and even since October 7th, being willing to have ceasefires as early as October 10th, I believe, and then a dozen times over since, even if it put them technically at a weaker position. So they have been willing to have these negotiations, to have a compromise, to what have you. And Hezbollah isn't that different on that. Hezbollah has said early on as well that they would be willing to stop everything if there is a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Now, you may not believe them. That's fine and that's fair because, a political party can lie. But that was the stated intention and that was the stated politics. Netanyahu is the one who ended that by assassinating Haniyeh and obviously since then by assassinating Nasrallah himself and all of the lead commanders of Hezbollah. How would someone who is even not necessarily a hardcore member of the party, but someone who depends on them now for protection if you're in the south or in the east or whatnot, how can anyone go to that person and say, you're on your own? You have to now depend on the party. And so the Israelis have made it even more of a zero-sum game than it needed to be, if you see what I mean.
There's a recently unearthed quote from the finance minister of Israel, Smotrich, who says that the Palestinian Authority is a burden, but Hamas is an asset.
Yes.
Because precisely it produces this sense of existential threat to Israel, which then justifies further escalation of their aggression.
Yeah.
Is there an end game? Is there a possible situation in which this doesn't result either in much more rapid escalation or in a permanent frozen conflict?
If there are negotiations between the West, broadly speaking, or the Americans and Iran, this can have an effect on Lebanon. If there is an agreement that they're going to stop that front, then Hezbollah would agree to that. Not that Iran tells them what to do in that sense, but it is part of they want. Hezbollah is not negotiating with the Americans. It is being negotiated via Iran. At the same time, and I think by now it's pretty clear, the Israelis have been given the green light to do almost anything they want. They've crossed any line, even stated lines by the Americans, that then nothing happens. Even they get rewarded with more weapons and more billions of dollars and whatnot. And so the fear right now very understandably so, is that they are emboldened by an entire year of genocide in Gaza and ongoing, of course, ethnic cleansing in the West Bank as well, in Jenin and elsewhere. And of course now in South Lebanon, because it does seem that as far as they're concerned, they want to create as many facts on the ground as they possibly can. And because I think that they think by doing so, they will permanently disable Hezbollah. And this is where I genuinely think they're wrong. I honestly think that they are either miscalculating, or I'm saying they. I know that even within the IDF, there are people who have said quite literally that in the past, that they cannot take on Hezbollah at the same time as taking on Hamas. But Netanyahu is a politician who was also captured himself, became more far-right with the years and captured by the far-right of Israel. It's not strictly rational, quote-unquote, in the sense of just following one's interest in whatever. There is a messianic element to this that is, by definition, long-term, but also very short-term. Long-term in the sense of we know what they want, like they want to occupy part of Lebanon, they want to colonize Gaza, they want to, of course, annex the entirety of the West Bank and whatnot. But it's also short-term in the sense that them wanting that doesn't mean they have the capacity for that. And Hezbollah is a much different phenomenon now than it was even 30 years ago, let alone 40 years ago, like in the 80s. And it does have capacity to withstand, as you mentioned, not necessarily winning in that sense, but to actually tire the Israeli out with time. Not only that, but it's managing to actually weaken part of the advances of the Israeli army in South Lebanon, while also targeting Israel itself with all of its missiles and rockets. I don't know what the end game comes from this other than some kind of international agreement or imposition of some kind. But with the Israelis especially even threatening UNIFIL, which is kind of the entire point of that international agreement the first time around.
Which is the United Nations
interim force in Lebanon or something like that, yeah. They're basically the UN peacekeepers in South Lebanon. Hezbollah has been basically calling them human shields for Hezbollah, accusing them of collaborating with Hezbollah, all like very absurd and because that UNIFIL forces include like Italy and Ireland and South Korea that are not allied with Hezbollah. But that's facts don't matter. Like it is propaganda at the end of the day, and they put forward a certain discourse as a way of preparing a certain politics. So if a certain advances, for example, or certain attacks. So I said, like just last week, as they started cranking up their rhetoric against UNIFIL, that they quite literally are going to target them next. And they have done this twice now, 3 times, I believe. There has been a bit of a pushback internationally, but I just don't know. I don't know to what extent these will work unless there is like genuine, like concrete actions in terms of an actual embargo, in terms of an actual sanction, and all of those things. Of course, the Americans will clearly, as we've been seeing with Biden, like defend Israel for as long as humanly possible and provide them with a lot of those funds and of course weapons to sustain themselves in the long term. But I don't believe this is feasible to just in and of itself to be sustained forever. They cannot just be funding and funding weapons, to the Israelis ad infinitum. Things change within American politics, things change. In the region, Iran might decide things differently. Different things happen, what I'm trying to say. That it's not necessarily as straightforward as like Netanyahu said he wants this and therefore this is what's going to happen.
In Iran, there was a recent election in which the sort of moderate candidate won. As far as I understand from Iran, matters of sort of foreign policy are not really directed by the president. They are directed by a sort of a combination of what you might call it the Iranian deep state, the High Council, which with the Ayatollah on top, yes. Yeah, and so do you think that makes a difference to the ongoing conflict, or is that sort of irrelevant to it?
It certainly makes a difference in the sense that like Iran is not. It's not that they haven't attacked Israel and of course been attacked by Israel directly, but it's not an all-out war. They haven't declared war against one another in a kind of conventional sense. And so there seems to be an understanding within the Iranian regime, in any case, that what they're going to do is to support their allies, especially Hezbollah, but of course the Houthis in Yemen, and to a lesser extent the militias in Iraq, Hashd al-Shabi and Kataib Hezbollah and others in Iraq. Notably, Syria is pretty absent from all of this, partly for the reasons that I mentioned. I don't think Assad is interested in a long-term conflict. Certainly doesn't have the capacity for it. I don't know when that changes. I don't know if it gets to the point where we saw, of course, the Iran's attacks a couple of weeks ago or so. That was sizable, but it seemingly did not weaken Israel in any kind of significant capacity. In fact, I can say this with some certainty, but I believe yesterday's attacks by Hezbollah with the drones did more damage in terms of just being more efficient. Because they're drones, I suppose, and they're harder to catch by the Israelis because they're unmanned drones. Anyway, I don't know. I'm not a military guy. But my understanding is that irregular warfare is something that the Israelis have historically more difficulties dealing with than conventional warfare. And let's not forget that Israel has not been in any conventional warfare since the 70s. The Yom Kippur War being the last one, the 67 obviously, but the 70s really being the last main one. When they invaded Lebanon, there was no state fighting them. The state had already disintegrated with the Lebanese Civil War. They're not fighting the Syrian regime. As I said, they've annexed the Golan Heights with little fanfare on the side of the Syrians, of Bashar al-Assad's regime. And they're not at war with Iraq, of course, the state itself, and they're not even, you might say, de facto at war with Iran, but like they don't have their warplanes bombing Iranian warplanes. That's not happening right now. I'm not saying it can't. These things can escalate pretty quickly, as we know. The Americans seem to be hell-bent on just providing Israel with whatever it needs, or at least what they think Israel needs. I genuinely don't know for how long this can last and how long they can sustain this. One other thing that we haven't talked about as much, because it's kind of parallel to the story of Hezbollah, is like Israeli politics itself. It's not as straightforward as just like having an entirely unified front against, a unified enemy. There's a lot of internal tensions, as we saw with that prison in the desert where they were raping Palestinian prisoners, and there was basically a break-in by other Israelis against the Israelis that were guarding that prison, including the break-in included members of the Knesset, and so you have elements of the Israeli political system that is more. I struggle to use terms like extreme because, from the perspective of an occupied population, it's always been extreme. But rhetorically and certainly in terms of what they're willing to do and how little, not even paying lip service to international law or whatnot, how far they're willing to go with that. And also in terms of how religiously oriented they are compared to before. And a lot of the members of Knesset, certainly the dominant coalitions now, and they are very extreme anti-Palestinian ideologues. Netanyahu has always been an anti-Palestinian ideologue, but he's also been, I think, primarily a politician for himself, first and foremost. The others, I'm not saying there isn't that element, of course, but they seem more ideologically driven in that sense. I genuinely think if there was a actual concrete pressure, pushback, even sanctions, threat of sanctions even, by the Americans, the Israelis would be singing a different tune. And the last example we know, the last time this happened actually was under Ronald Reagan in 1982. Reagan called, who was it at the time? I don't know if it was Ehud Barak. I don't think so. No, Rabin, I believe. I don't remember which Israeli prime minister it was in 82. After the Sabra and Shatila massacre, calling it a Holocaust to his face, on the phone. And it took one phone call, apparently a pretty short one, for the Israelis to decide to withdraw from Beirut. And this is where the occupation of South Lebanon started. The Americans have a lot of cards in their hands. They're just choosing not to use them. They seem to be okay with what the Israelis are doing. That's kind of the only objective conclusion here. And the consequences are pretty dire, as we've been seeing.
Is there anything else you think we should cover?
Very briefly, and I don't know, maybe with your audience, but the way Hezbollah is talked about on the left, broadly speaking, from the perspective of I've always seen myself on the left, and I'm of Lebanese-Palestinian origins, and my entire world is basically queer liberation and whatever in their world, is very puzzling. It's a very puzzling phenomenon. It's not that it doesn't exist in Lebanon, but even those in Lebanon that romanticize Hezbollah have more nuanced takes, I would say. We like what they did here, but we recognize that they are a right-wing party here. There's a bit more conversation, not always, but I feel a bit more, which I guess makes sense given that they are Lebanese and it's a Lebanese party. But Hezbollah has always had a ultra-conservative political project. By that I mean that it's not that they don't have any class analysis. This is it's subsumed within in a Hezbollah's version of Islamism, a very specific format of it. That's not the one that I think most Westerners are familiar with, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or whether it's the more extreme elements of the jihadis and whatnot. Hezbollah is not that. It's, of course, a Shia party. But in terms of their views on women, in terms of their views on the LGBTQ community, in terms of sectarianism, in terms of religious freedoms, they are on the conservative, even far-right side of things a lot of the time. And so it's very, and more importantly, maybe this is like on the social side, but on the economic side, they've always been a capitalist party. In the early days, when it was a civil war and there wasn't when one called themselves at the time like pro-free market or pro-socialism, it was more of a like aspiration because the state had collapsed obviously during the civil war. But Hezbollah, as it integrated, as I mentioned, the Lebanese system, also bought up land, became rentiers. They extract rent from people, and whatnot. They're able to do it less. The way they extract rent, for example, is not necessarily as violent as others, and part of that, and sometimes it's cheaper rent, and part of that is because they have this added fund, which is the Iranian one. So they're able to subsidize things a bit better, let's say, than other parties do. But they are part of the Lebanese system. Their main ally is the Speaker of Parliament, who's been Speaker of Parliament since 1992. Same guy, Nabi Hibri. As I said, they've had main allies that are billionaires, that in a country like Lebanon of only 5 to 6 million people, all of the prime ministers, with the exception of one, I believe, have been billionaires since 2005, two Hariris and Miati. And this puts them on the side of the corrupt status quo in Lebanon. In fact, that's the reason why they were the target, among others, but they were the biggest one and the most influential one by then, of the 2019 uprising. And Hezbollah's response at the time was to denounce all of us as foreign actors and foreign agents and being paid by the embassies and whatever, specifically targeting Shias who are anti-Hezbollah or critical of Hezbollah by the insult of like embassy Shias Safarat, i.e. they are paid by the embassies, which to me sounds a bit like how Zionists call Jews who don't like them or who are opposed to Zionism like self-hating Jews. There's a bit of that element to it. And Hezbollah integrated the war on terror narrative that is used against it by the Americans and Israelis. Hezbollah has a version of that they implemented in Syria. They call every Syrian, regardless of their ideology, whether they were jihadis, whether they were Islamists like of the Muslim Brotherhood style, which is Hamas's ideology historically, or whether they were like secular nationalists, they would call them all takfiris, which is an extremely sectarian terminology to use against Sunnis if you are a Shia party.
It means like blasphemer?
Yeah, basically. Takfir, yeah, exactly. And so they have been willing to deploy sectarianism and kind of this zero-sum game discourse when it suited them. And also when it suited them playing more, the cliche in Lebanon is like, the mosques and the churches next to one another and being more like al-aish al-mushtarak, which is like the communal living or like living with each other, as in between the sects and whatnot. So it really depends on when and where, but in terms of their outlook, there is nothing about them that's remotely left-wing in any traditional or even non-traditional understanding of it. They are an extremely hierarchical party. There is not a single woman in its entire hierarchy. And they are led by religious clerics. That makes them an enemy of anyone in Lebanon who is progressive, even liberal, certainly if you're on the radical left side of things. This doesn't change the fact that right now, when there is an invasion by the Israelis and when the Israelis are the superior threat, most people, including people who are highly critical of Hezbollah, including myself, acknowledge that there's no one else that can do anything about the Israelis. And so that's why I mean that fundamentally it goes back to Israel being our main problem. If there was a different situation, like a two-state solution, which is never going to happen anymore, obviously a one-state solution or some kind of anything that happens between the river and the sea, like in modern Israel, Palestine, I don't know what would happen to Hezbollah, because a lot of their raison d'etre is that. It's the fact that the Israelis are occupiers and they're occupying Palestinian lands, and they've of course occupied Lebanese land, and now they occupy, again, Lebanese lands. If that is gone, if something is done to pressure the Israelis and change that system or what have you, I'm not even saying like in this as I would view it, like I would like a one-state solution with everyone between the river and the sea under equal, with equal rights under the law, regardless of their nationality or ethnicities or religion or whatever. But even if that doesn't happen, some kind of peace deal, in quotation, some kind of Oslo 2.0, as imperfect and as probably unpopular as that would be, may be very bad for Hezbollah. But I think on the side of the Israelis, they're kind of thinking along the same lines, in the sense that they don't want any kind of compromises and they don't want to stop this. And so right now, again, to repeat that same argument, they are each other's best enemy, rhetorically speaking. And as long as there are any kind of threats from the Israelis, I don't see Hezbollah going anywhere. And I don't see their politics becoming more progressive or whatever. They are very much a reactionary party. In many ways, they react to the Israeli occupation right now. And as long as that's the status quo, I don't see why that or how that could change.
Elia Ayoub, thank you very much for coming on Novara FM.
Yeah, thank you for hosting.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support.